Welcome to the LibreQuest podcast. This is episode 51, and I'm joined by Linux programmer, Dev1 contributor, Plasma, and we met at the London meetup in Arlington, Texas. How's it going, Plasma?
Going well. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. So first I wanted to get into how you got into GNU/Linux.
Well, that all starts with the hard drive failure of 2014. So the story goes as it goes. In about, I think it was in December. Yeah, it was in late December of 2014. I was using Windows 8.1 on my laptop at the time, but the hard drive started dying. But initially, I was like, okay, not great, but I've been making regular backups, and I had also been doing the due diligent thing of occasionally test restoring my backups, because backups always succeed. It's the restores that fail. So I knew that my backups were good. So I was like, okay, I'll just throw in a new hard drive, restore from my backups, and everything will be great. Guess what? Everything was not great. The one time I needed the backups, they didn't work, which was really frustrating, especially having gone through all of the things you're supposed to do when it comes to backups. So I had a hard drive that was dying, and I could have just thrown in a new hard drive, installed Windows again, and just lived with lost data, but I'm stubborn. So I basically took that dying hard drive and set it on a shelf and left it there for a while. And in the meantime, I had been familiar with systems like Ubuntu and whatnot, and the concept of a live distro. So for a while, I was just basically booting my hardware off of a live distro. Early on, sometimes I was using Tails, and sometimes I was using just vanilla Ubuntu. And so that's, initially it was kind of just something I was planning to do short term until I could figure out how to get the hard drive to be recovered properly. But as time went on, I eventually realized I need to actually have a system with persistent state on it and not just use a live distro for everything. So I pulled some, I forget which of my computer boxes I pulled out, but I installed Ubuntu on it, just vanilla Ubuntu, and I used that for several months. And then I kind of got the itch for trying out different desktop environments, because I had just been using straight Ubuntu with Unity at the time. Or was that after the GNOME switch? I think that was before the GNOME switch.
Yeah, in 2014?
Yeah,
I think they didn't switch until, it might have been 2017 that they switched back, yeah. I believe.
So I was on Ubuntu for a few months. Then I started hopping through the various Ubuntu spins. The next one I went on to was Ubuntu GNOME Edition, which I was on for a few months. After that, I installed Ubuntu Mate for literally a day and decided, nah. And so I installed Xubuntu, running the XFCE desktop for after that. And I ran Xubuntu for quite a long time. So then fast forward to about a year and a half after the crash or the slow death of my hard drive. At the time, all during this time, I'd been working at a local mom and pop computer repair store. And I also started to use Xubuntu there on one of our diagnostic machines, just because I really started to like it at home. And one of the things that I started doing there is I started teaching myself how to use various data recovery tools that are packaged in Ubuntu. The one in particular I got really good with was GNU DD Rescue. And so there were several customers whose data I was actually able to recover with free software tools that I was able to teach myself. And I basically, that was roughly a year and a half after my hard drive started dying. So at around that time, I took my hard drive off the shelf, used what I learned, what I taught myself at work, and I was actually able to recover the entirety of my dying hard drive, save for 2 files. Because I was now using tools rather than just blindly doing a copy, I could actually see which files I had been unsuccessful in getting parts of the data out of. And thankfully, those 2 files were just log files. So everything,
nice. Yeah.
everything that I cared about, I was able to get back, which is a very happy ending story because data loss and hard drive crashes rarely end so happily. But by that point in time, I had been using various flavors of Ubuntu for a year and a half, and I really liked it. Not having to deal with Microsoft or just have updates that randomly decided it's time to install. It's nice. It's nice when you can just do all that at your leisure. So fast forward to around 2016, I started getting interested in Dev1, and I think it was roughly around the time of the ASCII release, or like right before the ASCII release, which is Dev1 2.0's codename. I migrated my system over to Dev1, and I've been using that ever since.
Very cool. Yeah, and I forgot to mention that you're actually in the studio with me.
Hi.
And you're the first in the studio guest that I've had, so welcome to the studio. It's really cool to have you here.
Great to be here.
I've noticed like a lot of you post a lot on IRC, and a lot of what you post is very much so free software advocacy. It's always use free software or free, firmware before you'll recommend something else. So how did you really get introduced to the ideology of free software and freedom respecting software?
I think it was largely just due to osmosis of just using, just from when I started using Ubuntu, I just kind of gradually got more and more involved in that sort of thing. There wasn't like one particular lightning bolt type of moment where I went from whatever you go to before you become a free software guy. But I like tearing things apart, and I don't like being obstructed by black boxes. I've actually started using Dev1 a lot more like it's Gentoo, in that I'm compiling a bunch of stuff with custom config flags, which,
cool.
Not for everyone, but I like to tinker.
Very cool. You'd mentioned something about bootstrapping, and I was going to ask if you can explain a bit about what bootstrapping is.
Okay, so this is something that I've been getting interested in recently. I wouldn't say that I'm a major contributor to the work that's going on. I point people to bootstrappable.org for a bunch of really talented people who are doing some really cool stuff. I realize I haven't said what bootstrapping is.
Right.
So, whenever you're compiling software, you need a compiler, right? Well, in order to get the compiler, you need to compile it, which means you need a compiler for your compiler, which means you need a compiler for your compiler for your compiler.
Okay.
And And very often, it's not uncommon to just kind of hand wave that away and just not look at it and just download a pre-compiled compiler and just use that and not go back any further. But there's a big effort right now in the bootstrappable software space that I've been following, where the goal is to create a fully documented, unbroken chain starting from the simplest piece of software that you can just load up as like a boot sector that's just enough to build something more complex, that's just enough to build something more complex, that's just enough until multiple steps of recursion later, you're up to a full GCC and everything. After that point, you can start with a pre-built GCC, but arbitrarily you can decide, no, I want to start one level further back or two levels further back, and it's documented and it's reproducible and it's simplified. And for certain languages like C, I wouldn't say it's straightforward, but it's definitely a lot easier to trace back the steps, whereas with some languages, it is a nightmare to try to make heads and tails of the bootstrap story.
So you would use bootstrapping to get a more customized, controlled compiler to use?
It's not so much about customization and control. It's more of just auditing of where stuff came from. Like a lot of modern toolkits and frameworks will have you just download a precompiled SDK and that's your starting point. But if you try to go and research, okay, how do you actually build the SDK from source? You start running into wall after wall after wall because a lot of this work that's happened, the documentation of it has just been thrown away or just not well preserved. The worst offender in this regard that I've seen is the programming language Scala. Are you familiar with Scala?
No, I'm sorry.
Okay, well,
how do you spell Scala?
Scala.
Okay, Scala.
And not meaning to pick on Scala, they just make it really easy. So just as an example, in Debian right now, the current version of Scala is it's either 2.11 or 2.12. But for the sake of this example, let's just focus on 2.11. So the earliest packaged version of Scala in Debian is 2.11.6. The version prior to that is 2.10. something. So having read on the bootstrappable.org website that Scala is one of the projects one of the languages that's still a open problem for bootstrapping, I decided, okay, I'll just see how far I can get, just to see how bad the problem is. Well, I go to the the file in Debian that tells you what you need in order to build something, the rules file. And to build 2.11.6, you need at least Scala 2.11, which is kind of a problem because the earliest version of 2.11 in Debian is 2.11.6, the version you're trying to compile. It gets worse.
Wow. Yeah.
Two of the other build dependencies for 2.11.6 Scala in Debian are a program called Scala XML and another package called Scala, I forget the exact name, it's like combinators, it's 3 words, it's Scala combinators something, I don't remember the exact details, but those 2 packages, in order to build them, you need Scala 2.11. So in order to build Scala 2.11, first you need itself, then you need 2 separate dependencies that each of them to build needs Scala 11 itself. And by the way, one of those 2 dependencies requires itself to build.
Wow, that's
so
pretty rough.
It is ridiculous.
So you said, what is the package? What is it called? There's like a file that tells you what stuff you need in order to build something.
Yeah, the basic anatomy of a Debian package. There are several files in a Debian package, but I would say the two most important ones are the rules file and the control file. The rules file basically is a make file that directs the build. And then the control file is a bunch of metadata that says these are what these are what binary packages this source package creates, and these are the dependencies for when you're installing this package, and these are the dependencies for when you're building this package.
Okay, so the control file is pretty much it carries all that information through to let your system know if you see something that says you don't have this dependency or you need this version, it's not compatible with your installed version. That's going to be coming from your control file in your deb package.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, I was kind of curious about that. So you're a Dev1 contributor, basically. Is that fair to say? Okay. And I've heard it said Dev1. Like, do you know the proper way to say it?
So this is something that I had to learn very early on as well. The pronunciation is Dev1, like DEV, the shortened word for developer, and then it's pronounced one like the number, but it's spelled UAN. Okay. My understanding is that it's the Italian pronunciation because some of the original Dev1, a couple of the guys who started Dev1 are both Italian, as I understand it.
Huh. Very cool.
So Dev1.
And you contribute some changes, like some changes for some of the package maintenance side of things?
I'm not currently a dedicated package maintainer for any of the given packages. Like, you won't find my name on the list. But like I said, I custom compile stuff a lot, and so I've sent a few patches to the other maintainers that says, hey, you've got it built this way. Could you add it with this line in this file and this line in this file so that it will compile a slightly different way? And I've gotten some changes in that way.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome, man. That's cool. We had been talking earlier about some of the interesting operating systems that you try, and just installing different operating systems. Like, what are some of the operating systems that you've kind of played around with? And you had said something about trying to build a computer that would be compatible across like different operating systems, like depending on like the hardware, trying to find that perfect hardware that's going to be compatible with the widest variety of operating systems. But what are some of the interesting operating systems that you've messed around with?
Well, let's see here. I've played around with React OS. That's the free software reimplementation of Windows XP. And technically Windows Server 2003. And
it tries to be a binary compatible option to Windows, pretty much, right?
Right. The goal is that you can take a Windows binary, throw it on React OS, and it will just work. So I've played a lot around with that. I've installed FreeDOS on a few old systems. DOS was actually the operating system on my first computer that I could call my very own. I'll actually slightly tangent just a moment. My first computer was actually a 386 that my mom actually helped me put together. This was back when I was like in elementary school.
Wow, that's awesome.
Like my family is very techy, and so we've got old computer hardware just all over the house.
Was it an Intel 386?
I honestly don't even have that computer anymore, but I think it was. I don't remember whether it was an Intel or it was an AMD clone, but it was a 386.
That's cool. Yeah, either way, that's cool.
And the operating system that I had to run on it was MS-DOS 3.3, and that was the computer I learned my first programming language on, which was GW Basic.
Nice. Very cool.
Okay.
So you got your start on DOS 3.3 and what GW Basic?
Yeah.
That's very cool.
Yep. running off of 5.25-inch floppy disks.
Yes, that's awesome, man. And so, what are some of the other modern? Because I don't think we specified like modern or kind of older operating systems, but like what are the different? I mean, other than because you said React OS, obviously Linux, obviously GNU/Linux, and different derivatives. But we'd been talking about GNU Hurd as well. And I'd ask you if you had any luck, because I've tried to install. My install got stuck on some PCI dependency, and it wasn't quite working right. And I haven't really tried on any other hardware. What's been your experience with GNU Hurd?
Hurd I've actually not used as much as I want to, or as I'd like to. I'd like to play around with it some more. The last time I tried to install it, I was trying to install it on, I think it was a Pentium 3 laptop. Nothing particularly special about why I wanted to install it on there. It's just I had a Pentium 3 laptop and I wanted to install something on it. In that scenario, I ran into the problem of the installer needed more than the onboard 256 meg of RAM. So in that instance, I ultimately gave up and installed Minix instead. And played around with that. Minix is cool. I wanted, when I was working with that, I wanted to try out some microkernel-based system. And since Hurd was giving me issues at the time, I played around with Minix, and that's fun. As far as the most esoteric operating system I've tried, that would have to be Temple OS. Which I have gotten to run on bare metal on a few systems, but it's very finicky as to if you're trying to run it on bare metal, you've got to stick within certain hardware limitations.
What is kind of the backstory? I know there's some kind of interesting backstory to Temple OS. Do you know, like the creator of Temple OS, what the story is there?
There is a long and complicated story. The operating system was written by a guy who was attempting to create the third temple, which is as ridiculous as it sounds. Tragically, the developer passed away in, I believe, 2018. So.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
How about that?
But the actual technology of the system itself is actually really impressive. It's very limited, but it breaks a lot of standard convention that you don't realize is there until it's not. Trying to think of a good example of that. Well, for one thing, the compiler and the shell are the same thing. The compiler language and the shell language aren't separate. So
that's interesting.
Yeah, it's really weird.
Yeah, definitely not Unix.
It's not a Unix. Yeah. It's not a DOS. It's not really anything. But
does it manage to do two things at once or do them both well? In contrast to the Unix philosophy.
I don't actually know if it's technically multitasking. But it's weird.
Yeah, it sounds interesting for sure. I wanted to ask you about some of the programming languages that you have experience in. You already said you started with GW Basic, but what are some of the other languages that you also use?
Well, I've programmed in C++ and Java. I'm mostly the CS courses I took in college were mostly in those two languages. I written a fair amount of shell scripts, or just invoked a long pipeline on the command line. I've in the last year learned awk, which is a beautiful little language if you're wanting to manipulate text. It is domain specific, but within its domain, it is some beautiful code.
Very cool. Very cool. So I have one. This is my last question for you, but we can talk about other stuff if you have any topics of interest. But I know you're very much so a free software advocate, and so I'm wondering, are there any good freedom-respecting video games that you can recommend?
I can indeed. It's almost like I fed you that question. The game that I've been playing a lot of recently, it's written in Java, and I've been playing it on Android, or Lineage OS specifically, but it's also available on desktop. It's a game called Shattered Pixel Dungeon. It's a little roguelike. Are you familiar with roguelikes?
No, not really.
Okay.
I'm a first-person shooter kind of player.
Okay.
So.
Well, roguelikes are, as the name implies, mechanically similar to the old mainframe game Rogue, which basically drew a maze as text ASCII art on a screen, and you would be the little @ sign, and you would move around the grid, fighting monsters and collecting gold and trying to get down to the lowest level of the dungeon to collect an amulet. And whenever you would die, that's game over and you have to start again. There's no saving. So permadeath is a thing.
That sounds like Pac-Man a bit.
I mean, incredibly very loosely. I never really thought of Pac-Man as a roguelike.
When you're explaining, I'm thinking Pac-Man the whole time.
But
and what's it called again? I'm sorry.
Shattered Pixel Dungeon.
Shattered Pixel Dungeon. Okay.
But yeah, it's this little game that, well, I say little. It's actually grown quite a bit, and the developer is still working on it. It's actually a fork of an older game called Pixel Dungeon that the developer released the source code for in, I believe, 2013, if I've got that right. And so this current developer, a guy by the name of Evan, I don't remember what his last name was. I've read it somewhere. But he initially started working on it as just a balance tweak, as a balance mod, but then he kept working on it, and it's hardly recognizable as the game that it forked off of. The basic premise of the game is like the original Rogue. You're on a little dungeon. It's drawn in pixel art rather than in ASCII art, and you are basically trying to get to the bottom layer of a multi-layer dungeon, fighting monsters, collecting treasure, leveling up weapons and armor, and trying to get the magical amulet at the bottom. I have yet to beat it. I've gotten down to the 21st level of the dungeon, but it is a really fun game, and it's free software.
How do you get the game? Is it in a lot of repositories?
It is in it's. I currently play it off of on Android, where I downloaded it from F-Droid, the app store where it's nothing but free software.
Right.
There's currently a bug filed in Debian as a request for package. The issue with getting it into Debian at the moment is that it's built on the libgdx library, which is dependent on the LWLG. I forget it's a smaller game library that it is. The current version that it needs is written in Kotlin, which is one of the newer JVM languages.
Yeah. And
going back to the bootstrapping issue earlier, the problem with Kotlin is that Kotlin is largely written in Kotlin. So
yeah, when I did that, when I made an app for my cousin, and I had the choice of Kotlin or JavaScript, and I'm like, JavaScript? I don't know what Kotlin is. So is Kotlin basically like a simplified JavaScript?
It's as I understand it, it's a Java, but with a different and supposedly cleaner and easier to use syntax. I haven't ever touched any Kotlin code, so I'm not one to judge. But
well, I mean, if you look at like a JavaScript sample next to Kotlin, it looks like JavaScript, but just less lines.
Well, it's kind of it's similar to Java, not to JavaScript. The annoying thing about JavaScript is that they named it after Java, even though it's not like Java. It's like it has curly braces, and that's about where the similarities end.
Right. Well, are there any other cool topics you want to touch on?
Well, you had briefly mentioned, and then we kind of moved on, the maximally compatible computer.
Yes. Yeah.
So one of my projects that's kind of on the back burner at the moment is to try and build a computer that is compatible with the most number of esoteric and hobbyist operating systems possible, because a lot of the smaller, more indie OSs, less manpower, so every piece of hardware that needs to be supported, someone's got to implement that. So pretty much only the easiest to implement pieces of hardware ever get written. So the system that I'm looking to build would be ideally a Core 2 Duo or Core 2 Quad based computer in like a socket 775 socket.
Yeah, LGA 775. Yeah.
Yeah. Is it I don't think it's an LGA. It could be an LGA. I don't know.
The 775 is LGA.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry, but go ahead.
Yeah. Then it would definitely have IDE hard drives rather than SATA, because IDE is apparently easier to implement than SATA.
So you might have to get like a PCI to IDE card.
Well, hopefully it would have IDE built onto the IDE header built onto the board. It would definitely, for a lot of operating systems, it would definitely help a lot to have a onboard floppy header. For systems like anything DOS derivative like FreeDOS.
You're making. I have an Optiplex 755. It's a small form factor machine. It actually has it's a proprietary floppy header, but actually I bought the floppy for it. That kind of system might work for you. It's actually got a quad Q9550. That would be an interesting piece of hardware to test to see how compatible it is. What you're making me think of. But go ahead.
Yeah, and then the other major components that I would have in this system I'd like to build, the network adapter would definitely be a Realtek RTL 8139, which is, as I understand it, basically the easiest network adapter to write code for. It's emulated in basically all the popular emulators, and basically every OS that has networking capability that I've tried supports the Realtek 8139, so that's an obvious choice. And then for a sound card, I would throw in a Sound Blaster 16.
Nice.
Just because of how ubiquitous that is.
Yep.
And I think that's all the major components for maximal compatibility. Theoretically, that system could run everything from FreeDOS to TempleOS to ReactOS to Minix to Herd. Theoretically, though I haven't actually yet played with this OS, I'm just kind of interested in trying it. That should work with Serenity OS, which is an OS that answers the question, what if Unix had a GUI? What if Unix had the GUI from Windows 95?
Awesome.
That configuration should also be compatible with something like Tuwaru OS, and just several others.
I've never even heard of some of these.
Yeah, I kind of geek out about weird esoteric operating systems.
That's very cool. You got me. I'm gonna have to try GNU Herd on my 755 that I have now. It's got bad caps. I actually need a new. I don't want to go to replace them This is annoying. I think I'm actually just going to get a new motherboard for it, but now I'm going to have to try it on there to see how compatible it is. All right, so switching back to some of the free software games that are available, what are some other titles you could recommend?
Another one that I really like and I've been playing recently is a game called Mindustry. Are you familiar with it?
No, I've not heard of that one.
Okay. So Mindustry basically answers the question, what if Factorio was a tower defense game? Are you familiar with Factorio?
No, I haven't played that one either.
Okay. Well, in that game, you are building an assembly line, harvesting minerals and resources from the earth, and basically building up a whole plant to construct stuff. Mindustry is like that, but the goal is as to defend against waves of enemies in a tower defense style. So you're basically collecting raw resources, transporting them on conveyor belts, using them to build various defensive structures. It's a lot of fun if you like tower defense.
That's cool. And where is that one available?
That one is available on F-Droid, on Steam, on itch.io, and just from the developer's GitHub.
So a lot of these games are available on desktop and on mobile?
Yeah, that one. Both of those are available on desktop and mobile. Yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. So do you have any other really good titles that you can recommend as far as free software, freedom respecting titles?
Let's see here. I had one other that off the top of my head, and it just blanked.
Was it Super Tux?
No. Not Super Tux.
Okay.
Let's see. Well, as far as first-person shooters, some of the best of those are Xonotic's really good. Good old Doom or Free Doom are really fun. I usually play using the Crispy Doom engine. Quake 3 Arena's engine powers obviously Quake 3. It also powers Open Arena. One game that I haven't yet gotten the chance to try out, but looks really neat, is a game called Unvanquished. It's built off of a derivative of possibly a derivative of the Quake 3 engine, I think. And it's a first-person shooter real-time strategy where there's a human faction and an alien faction, and
wow, you're Unvanquished.
Mm-hmm.
That's cool. It kind of makes me think of Quake Wars. It's two opposing sides and first-person shooter. Is it like objective-based gameplay?
It's destroy the enemy base.
Okay.
Is the objective.
All right. Very cool. Well, thank you, Plasma, for being here and actually being in this studio with me. It's really awesome. And where can listeners find your content, or where can they find you online? Okay. Well, I'm not really on any of the social media sites. I'm not even on Mastodon. But if you want to contact me, I mostly hang out on IRC. My handle is Plasma41. It's all lowercase, no spaces, no hyphens. 41 is the numerals 4 and 1. I'm on. I used to be on Freenode, but then the Freenode debacle recently happened. So I'm on libera.chat. I'm on OFTC. I'm on QuakeNet. I'm on several, but the main one is Libera. Just Plasma41, and I usually hang out in the Dev1 IRC channels. Very cool. Well, thanks again for being here. It's been awesome. Been fun. If you enjoyed this episode, you can join me on Locals at LibreQuest.locals.com, where I'll be posting exclusive interviews, some of my music, and other things, and we can talk about whatever you want to talk about as well. For other ways to support me, you can visit LibreQuest.org, that's LibreQuest.org, and thank you for being a listener. Until next time, I'm Matt, and this is LibreQuest.